Got it.
Okay, we are now recorded. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. I'm Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay and director of the Dispute Resolution Program. Welcome to our monthly breakfast. These breakfast sessions are co-sponsored by the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York and the City University of New York Dispute Resolution Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. These breakfasts started after 9/11. There were lots of queries about what we could do as dispute resolvers, and I called a breakfast. And since then, we've been meeting until March 2020. We met at John Jay. Since April 2020, we've been meeting online. These breakfasts are recorded and the recordings are posted on www.acrgny. This morning is our 239th breakfast. These breakfasts are put together each month by a wonderful team consisting of Julie Denny, Chuck Newman, Matthew Latimer, Nikki Borofsky. I'm so delighted to have them each month as part of this wonderful team. And our apologies this morning for the glitch. We had two breakfasts going on at once. I think that we have been able to transfer everyone over to this breakfast. I want to give a shout out to Professor Teresa Booker, my colleague at John Jay, who alerted me by cell that we had another group of colleagues in another waiting room. Thank you so much, Teresa, for saving the morning here. And with us this morning is probably one of my, I hate to use the term, oldest colleagues in the field, Homer. But I think that we have been in this field for the same number of years for in many different capacities and relationships. As professors at the same university, we were both at SPIDER. We were concerned about using that acronym because it doesn't resonate like it used to. The Society of Professionals in Dispute Resolution. We were both on the board at the same time, and we would have been meeting at this hour on a Saturday morning to discuss board issues back in the day when phone calls were the norm. Homer, I can't tell you how excited I am that we're reconnecting many years later. It feels like we're just picking up where we left off so many years ago. As we usually do, I'm going to turn this over to Julie for a more formal introduction. And thank you everyone for being with us. I know many of you are interested in knowing whether we're going to be continuing online. For the foreseeable future, yes, we will be continuing these breakfasts online since we don't know what space we can use at the college or what capacity we could have in our meeting rooms. So even though we're going back in person in the fall for about 50 to 60% of our classes in person, we still have not gotten any green lights on large gatherings. So look forward to seeing you all online for the foreseeable future. And with that, Julie, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Maria. As I said to Homer earlier this morning, I choose to make these introductions shorter rather than longer, but this man is a paragon in our field. We are beyond excited that Homer is with us today. I'm going to list about 5 things that he's done or is about to do just to give you a general idea of how distinguished he is, and then turn it over to Homer because you're here to listen to him and not me. For starters, he's a professor at Howard University. He won the 2020 D'Alimberti Award from the ABA. As Maria said, he's a former SPIDER board member and president, SPIDER is the predecessor to the Association for Conflict Resolution, and there are just a handful of us who remember SPIDER. He's the president-elect of the National Arbitration Association. He's former chair of the ABA section of dispute resolution. You get the picture. We're really lucky to have him here today. And he's weathered the storm of all the problems we had this morning. So Homer, thank you for your patience and tolerance. I want to say just that if you have questions during his presentation, please put them in the chat and we'll kind of monitor those. And at the end of his presentation, we'll start asking those questions. Okay, Homer, take it away. And I think you want to.
All right.
There you go. Yeah, great.
Thank you, Julie, for the introduction, and thank you, Maria, for that trip down memory lane as well. I appreciate that. What I want to talk to you about this morning, or talk with you about this morning, is something that I think concerns all of us in the ADR field. Many of my remarks are based upon the experience, on the primacy of my experience, which is labor management, arbitration, and mediation. But I believe that what I'm going to talk about and have written about is applicable generally to the ADR field. And that is unconscious bias in the selection of neutrals. This is based on an article written by me and my colleague, Alan Simonette, and it appears in the Howard Law Journal, where I teach at Howard Law School. Let me start with this. In 2003, Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote the following: "It has been 25 years since Justice Lewis F. Powell first approved the use of race to further an interest in diversity. We expect that 25 years from now, the use of race will no longer be necessary to further the interests of diversity and inclusion." Justice O'Connor's deadline in the case of Grutter versus Bollinger concerned diversity in higher education, and that deadline will be upon us in 2028. The pace of progress to diversity, equity, and inclusion suggests that many institutions in our society, including the labor management dispute resolution community and the ADR community at large, are running out of time to meet that deadline. So what is our purpose here today? I believe it's this: increase the speed of the bend of that slow arc of a moral universe toward justice. Many of you will recognize this as a very famous saying by Martin Luther King. He was often quoted this. So what I want to do this morning in about 20 minutes time that I have before we have questions is talk about the problem, what I call the front end and the back end issues. Talk about thinking outside of the box based on empirical data. And then explain the plan, that is the Ray Corollary Initiative, and how we might meet the threat to the RCI, and a little bit about the pledge that I think I see. A little background. What this graph represents are the number of persons of color, male and female, who have been members of the National Academy of Arbitrators since its founding 75 years ago. The numbers, I took the names out, but each of those bars represents a name. So what does all this mean in terms? And I cite my organization, of which I will be president, the National Academy of Arbitrators, because I think it's indicative of the issues that we face in the ADR community generally. What it means is what we have in this chart, 43 persons have been members, persons of color have been members of the Academy since its founding. The total members admitted since 1947 including the admittees up to 2019. I haven't updated the count to 2022 yet, but the numbers don't change appreciably. The persons of color admitted to the academy is 43. The percent of academy members are persons of color is around 3%. Now, why do I talk about the academy? Because the academy represents what is supposed to be the mastery of labor management arbitration. Invitation to be a member is made based upon acceptance of the person's work by the advocacy community. And so I think it's indicative of what we are here to talk about today. Definition of terms. What am I talking about when I say diverse neutrals? Black, Latinx, Indigenous, AAIP, other people of color, and women. Persons of differing sexual orientations and gender identities. Persons living with disabilities. Now, we all know who are working in this area that these definitions are changing, but this is the operative definition I'm going to be using today. So, the real problem, the selection of the neutral process. What's in the black hat? Now, before I go into this, let me back up a little bit and talk about what I call the front end problem, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about today. The front end problem I describe, and my co-author described in the article, as how to create the pipeline so that there are more diverse persons coming into the field, both in the labor management as well as into the ADR field, both as mediators, arbitrators, and playing other roles in the ADR field. Obviously, we haven't reached the kind of critical mass of diverse persons that we would like to have in the field, coming into the field. But we have been working on it, and we continue to work on it. And there are many people on this call can name, I can identify organizations that have been attempting to increase the number of persons of color, to increase diversity in the ADR field. What we haven't talked about, and what I'm talking about today, what we haven't talked about very much is the selection process. So you come into the field, you're attempting to build the practice, both as a mediator, as an arbitrator. How do you get selected? And we know some of the difficulties of that. Well, one of the things, and this, I don't represent that the RCI is the end all and be all of all approaches for the purpose of diversity. I suggest, however, that it allows us to try something other than simply say, isn't it too bad we don't have greater diversity? And that it's worth a try. So, the selection of the neutral process is one in which generally the selectors, the advocates very often, not very often, the advocates are the ones who do the selection of the neutral. And so what we want to do is talk about that selection process and talk about what might be going on and what the data seems to suggest is going on. So here's an illustration of the process. On the right-hand side, my right-hand side of the hat, the parties are given a list of neutrals, potential neutrals to be selected for them. The neutrals, they do whatever, which is just represented by the abracadabra in the black hat. That's the neutral selection process. And then at the other end, the selection of the neutral. And generally, that neutral is a representative of the status quo. And what do I mean by the status quo? Well, before I identify that, the outcome of the selection process is often represented by, I pick the arbitrator or mediator who I know. Now, I see that translating into the possibility or real probability of unconscious or implicit bias. And so the question is, how do we begin to create selection process that results in persons other than white, old, older anyway. In arbitration, in my field, the median age is somewhere around 65 to 72 in terms of arbitrators in labor management, and who are white. How do we begin to address that is the question. So what's the question that we should be concerned about? I think the question is, does it matter who and how many are in the slate of finalists for the selection of the neutral? Think about that for a moment. Does it matter who and how many? When the status quo, I would suggest to you that it does matter and that the empirical data suggests that it matters as well. When the status quo looks like this, the likelihood is that the selection outcome will reflect that status quo. There's the pool. What do you expect? The same thing is going to result in terms of the selection process. When that status quo adds only one diverse person or woman, the likelihood is that a diverse person is not going to be selected. So, when the pool, however, of candidates contains at least 30% diverse persons, the chance of a diverse candidate being selected goes up exponentially. Now, let me say here before I go on that the process does not say anything about how selected. What we're talking about is that if the slate contains a 30% diverse slate, those are the persons who are going to be considered for appointment. Doesn't mean that any particular person is going to be selected. It just means that the pool is much more representative of the total society, the workforce, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we're trying to do, is bring about that better representation of the neutral who's working in a dispute where the disputing community may very well be much more diverse than what we traditionally have in the selection process. So the perception of the status quo is then malleable. It's capable of being shaped or formed and then reformed. And the perception of what competence looks like is also malleable. Right now, we tend to think the status quo, if it's all white, then there's no question of competence. But we start adding people of color, and what's the first question? Qualified. Even though that person or those persons of color are selected from the same pool that their colleagues are. And this is some of the sources, the research that this is based on is a study that was published in the Harvard Business Review in 2016. And I'm happy to provide that to you at the end. But what does that study tell us then? We look at this chart and we start from the bottom, as we saw earlier. If the pool has 4 people in it and only one is a woman, 0% chance of a woman being selected. As we move up, we see that the odds become better. So that 3 women and 1 man, 67% chance that a woman will be selected for the position. So 2 women in the finalist pool of 4, the odds of hiring a woman are 79.14% times greater, according to the study that I've just cited. What's truly amazing is this one. 2 persons of color in the finalist pool of 4, the odds of hiring a person of color are 94% times greater. Now, the question that we would want to ask here is why? And by the way, it doesn't matter what the size of the pool is if we maintain the 30% metric. The tendency is the same, similar kind of outcome, a greater chance that a diverse person is going to be selected. Where there's only one diverse person in the pool of finalists, the difference between the one and the norm is then highlighted. That's the point that the empirical studies seem to point to. Translation for the selector, the advocate who is selecting the arbitrator, or selecting the mediator. It's risky to deviate from the norm or the status quo. Therefore, what do? I select who I know. And who do I know? Probably, more than likely, other white males who are senior. And therefore, the status quo continues to perpetuate. And that's the point I'm making here. I select who I know, and I know looks like me. Now, that's an overview of the implicit bias that I think it may not answer the entire question, but I think that by this time in the history of what we're trying to do, we accept the possibility and probably the high probability that bias can enter into the selection process, and that it is something that we ought to address and attempt to see to it that it is not playing the role that we think that it has played in the past. And there have been three approaches. And this is where I want to talk about the Ray Corollary Initiative. The use of the Mansfield Rule and the Mansfield Rule Certified is intended to be, these are the three approaches. The Rooney Rule is what I want to talk about, the Mansfield Rule, and the Ray Corollary Initiative, which is based on the first two. The Rooney Rule, for those of you who are football fans, know that it was adopted in 2003 and was named for the then Pittsburgh Steelers chair, Dan Rooney. He persuaded the other teams to agree that when there were open coaching positions and high-level managerial positions, that the teams would interview at least one minority candidate for that head coaching vacancy. There have been some studies on the Rooney Rule, and from 1992 through 2014, it is statistically significant that a minority candidate was more likely to fill an NFL head coaching vacancy in the post-Rooney era than in the pre-Rooney era. Now, I'm not here to advocate the Rooney Rule or to necessarily defend it. It has many flaws. But the concept enters the idea, if the minority candidates aren't in the pool, they can't be considered for the position. Pretty simple logic. And that's where we should be going. And now, let's turn to the Mansfield Rule, what it is and how it works. The Diversity Lab works with, at the beginning, worked with 102 law firms. It's now increased to around 300 or 400 law firms. And the idea is to ensure that that if a firm is Mansfield certified, that firm has considered at least 30% diverse lawyers for all governance and leadership roles in that firm. The firm operating with Diversity Lab and seeking to become Mansfield certified keeps data to show that they have affirmatively considered at least 30% women, attorneys of color, LGBTQ+, and lawyers with disabilities. Notice, considered. There's no dictate under the Mansfield Rule that any particular person with any particular characteristic be selected, but considered. And what we're talking about, considered for what? Considered for equity partner promotions, or formal client pitch opportunities, and senior lateral positions. The last three, for those who are not lawyers, are very important positions in law firms. Making the client pitch and being on that team that brings that client in is very important. What about the experience of those who have become Mansfield certified? White & Case completed its certification in 2019 and won the Diversity Lab Award that year, and put this on their website, that the 30% metric and the built-in accountability, according to White & Case, have had a positive effect on encouraging our leaders to expand the pool of talented lawyers that they develop and select as the next generation of leaders. A pretty sound endorsement that the Mansfield certification process does result in a positive change in the diversity of the firms. Now, let's come to the Ray Corollari Initiative. The Ray Corollari Initiative is named after Charlotte E. Ray, who graduated from Howard University School of Law in 1872. And she is the first Black woman to receive a law degree in the United States and the first Black woman to be admitted to a bar in the United States. So what is the corollary? What is the plan? Quite simple. Expand the work that has been done and the lessons that have been learned in big law via the Mansfield Rule and the Rooney Rule to the arbitration selection process and the mediation process and the selection of other neutrals in the ADR community. So it's not creating a new rule. We don't need a new rule. What I'm suggesting is look at the history of what's happened with the Rooney Rule, what's happened with the Mansfield Rule, and the Ray Corollari says, let's build on that. Let's experiment. Let's see if we can make something work. I'm not dictating how exactly it would work. I'm just suggesting that if we come together as the ADR community and commit ourselves to this goal in this way with measurable metrics and with accountability and with transparency, we can lick this problem. The Ray Corollari Initiative applies then to the following. We want a commitment by and a collaboration among the sections of the American Bar Association, other entities that maintain arbitrator rosters, lawyers and others who select arbitrators, and those public and private entities that hire the lawyers who select the arbitrators. So what we're trying to do then is build a national task force that would reach out to and partner with the ADR community as the Diversity Lab has done with Big Law. To date, we have no such structure. What I would like to talk about and persuade the ADR community is let's step up and create that structure that would allow us to begin the work that we need to do and that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor told us that we would be completed by 2028. So the first step has been taken by the National Academy of Arbitrators. The Board of Governors in 2019 established the RCI Organizing Committee, and they adopted the RCI as a major initiative of the Academy. The American Bar Association section of dispute resolution has also endorsed the RCI. Coming back to the Academy, the Organizing Committee of the Academy has taken a role in trying to develop this national task force to implement the Ray Corollari. Another important thing to keep in mind is what we want to do is to develop an internal rule modeled in accordance with Title VII, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and adapt that to the specifications that will best fit the procedures of the ADR community. So we want to recognize that, one, we will always want to be consistent with the existing law, and two, that there are differences, different communities, different interests, and so one size may not fit all. But we want to institute a rule described that in which the selecting entity will always consider candidates from underrepresented populations in the finalist pool before making a final decision with respect to selecting an arbitrator, a mediator, or any other neutral. We also need accountability on the part of the participants in the Ray Corollary Initiative. And that means collecting and sharing data related to the actions taken to bring about the commitment. What we have done for too long, in my opinion, in the ADR community, because I don't want this to be seen as an indictment that the ADR community has done nothing. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that we have forgotten, I think, an important ingredient of our DNA. Collaboration and collaborative work results in better outcomes. Instead of us working in silos and not sharing our experiences, both good and bad, with others who are attempting to bring about diversity, we continue to make the same errors over and over again unnecessarily. And where one entity has had some success, we don't know about it. So what has happened thus far with regard to the Ray Corollary? I'm not at liberty to identify the employer, but I was sent about 3 weeks ago an email from a major national employer in the United States who is about to go into bargaining with all the unions that represent that employer all over the United States. The Director of Labor Relations has put as a formal proposal on the table that the employer and the union agree that any arbitration slates created will be 30% diverse. And it's specifically based upon what I've said here with regard to the Ray Corollary Initiative. There are others who are working in that way. What I'm suggesting and working on right now is putting together a national conference that would work specifically, be devoted specifically to this question of diversity in ADR, sharing our experiences. Hopefully, what comes out of that is a concrete organizational structure that will keep this going forward in a way that's useful. So I'm talking about a national effort, a collaboration among all stakeholders, a commitment to the 30% consideration rule as a requirement for participating in the task force, and social accountability and transparency, what I've talked about already. That is sharing, collecting data. Many of us are academics, and we know what ain't measured ain't real. And so data collection is important, but equally important is transparency and collaboration. So these are the ingredients that I would suggest are the necessary elements of moving forward with a plan like this. So the RCI would be the ADR community's demonstrable commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the selection of diverse neutrals. With that, I want to thank you for your time today, and glad to enter into questions and discussion.
Thank you, Harvey, I'm sorry, Homer. There are a couple of questions right now. One is, what if the selectors are diverse? What if there's a broad cross-section of selectors who are choosing out of the pool? Does that change the dynamic at all?
Well, the answer to that question is we don't know, because for the most part, the selectors are not diverse. And to some extent, some of this is based upon conjecture, narrative, and not sufficient empirical data, because we haven't done the kind of research in the field on this that we need to do. My sense, however, from talking to the number of people, is that the selectors tend not to be diverse either. And so we get the same outcomes.
Okay, so there's something to address. Someone asked, was religion ever considered as a factor of diversity, since it's often an issue?
It is not in, it has not been in most of the literature that I've looked at, been seen as a major barrier as race and gender and other kinds of factors. Now, again, notice, depending upon where you are, that might become a bigger issue. And that's why I'm saying we need to come together and collaborate about the scope of the problem, how to approach the problem, and so that we can address all the nuances that may exist. The Ray corollary doesn't suggest a monolithic result or solution.
Here's another one. Laura Castor writes, many corporations already have adopted diversity initiatives, but they often fail to include the law firm's selection of experts and neutrals. If we simply encourage the inclusion of metrics year over year of selection or recommendations of neutrals, and if the corporations required improvement, that would help us move the needle.
I completely concur. And that is one of the things that I'm working on and focusing on with the ABA CPR right now, to develop a pledge in which corporations and others who are responsible for the creation and selection of rosters pledge that they will try to bring about the 30% consideration that the Ray corollary is talking about. And further, with regard to corporations, since that's what the question was about, that corporations will monitor their outside firms who do the selection. Many under the Mansfield rule already do that with regard to being Mansfield certified. That is, the corporation has created a report card for the outside firm and has told the outside firm, we want to know what you are doing with regard to diversity, and we want it in data, in hard data, and we want it reported annually. And your remuneration may very well depend upon how successful you are in meeting our goals for diversity. So I think you're the questioner is absolutely right that part of the issue that we have to get to the clients and get them to understand that they need to push their vendors, push their law firms, and create a structure for monitoring that.
Alan Marks has a question. Alan, if you unmute yourself, you can ask it.
Yeah, the topic today is about unconscious bias, in a time where bias is anything but unconscious and is very transparent. So my question has to do with the issue of choosing someone who they know. Is it a question of when they choose someone they know, they choose them on the basis of color, or they choose them on the basis of how they will fit into the mindset and the structure of the corporation and organization itself, and further the mindset and of that particular corporation and entity? Will they further that stream that the business is being run on and that the corporation is living under?
If I understand your question correctly, I think the two are related. The two questions, the two aspects. You said color and race, I believe, right?
I think it's more about whoever you choose for whatever corporation or business you're entering into. How much does color or race enter into it, as opposed to you fitting into the mindset of the corporation. If the corporation is corrupt and they're looking for people who accept corporate corruption, does it matter whether or not that person is of color or a woman or of gender, whatever their gender? It's a question of fitting into the corporate structure. And so are they really looking for someone or fulfilling the quotas in order to satisfy the society we're living in? We're living in a society clearly which is moving closer to acceptance or desire for more people of color and gender and other issues, women. But is that really the issue? Is the issue more a question of the morality and the ethics that the corporation brings to the table?
Well, that may be the question of the morality of the corporation may be an issue. And I still believe that race and ethnicity and gender play a role in that, in the selection. That is, yes, the question of bias is not a straightforward straight line. There are lots of different ways of cutting that. And we need to do more work with regard to that. I think that what we face today is that we haven't addressed the question of race and gender and other biases, which we've acknowledged that all of us have. And I think that now, does that list increase with more research? Maybe it does. And I'm very open to considering how do we address that. But I think that the immediate question that we face, the most immediate one, is still the one that Justice O'Connor addressed in the Grutter case.
Chuck has an interesting question. Since we know selectors, A, will reach out to neutrals they know, B, could we suggest that A ask B for recommendations of diverse neutrals known by B, either to be a co-member with B or a neutral panel, or simply A saying, you know, we love you, B, but can you introduce us to some diverse neutrals so we can enlarge our quiver? And he asks if that is okay under the rules of ADR service provider organizations.
Well, I can't speak for, don't purport to speak for any provider organization. Right. But I do know from my own experience that what has been described has been done by some neutrals. Mm-hmm. That is, they have reached out to diverse persons and asked and invited them to either co-arbitrate, co-mediate, work with them, and also to make themselves available to be suggested to the parties in those instances. And so, yes, that is another way I think that we can address the issue of diversity. It's certainly not precluded by what I have presented today.
Okay, lots of thank yous, lots of wonderfuls, which you'll be able to see later, Homer. Harvey suggests that in general, pledges have a powerful effect on better outcomes.
Which is the reason why the ABA section of dispute resolution and CPR and others are working so hard to get the pledge finalized and then to begin to move that forward in promoting it, with the end result of amending ABA Resolution 105, which you will recall is the diversity in ADR resolution passed by the House of Delegates 4 years ago, to add to it the 30% metric as a part of Resolution 105. So the route that we're going right now is attempting to develop the pledge, rewrite the pledge so it's appropriate for whatever organization is being approached, and then use that as a basis for also bringing about a proposal and a report to the House of Delegates of the ABA to alter Resolution 105.
I need to interject an apology to you. Probably most of the people on this call know that what I called the National Arbitration Association is actually the National Academy of Arbitrators, and that you are at Howard Law School, not at Howard. My apologies.
That's perfectly all right. Thank you.
Get through it a little faster than necessary. Hang on, we have a couple new ones here. It's been displayed that some corporations will use the leverage of picking diversity just to sadly look like diversity on the surface, yet will conduct corruption and maintain implicit bias and remain with, I hope you get this, and remain with no change or transformation. So they do it as a symbol, but it's ineffective, I think is what he's saying.
As a matter of fact, that has been the allegation with regard to the NFL and the Rooney Rule, that at the height of the application of the Rooney Rule, we had and excuse the sports analogy for those of you who don't follow, but there was a Super Bowl in which both coaches were Black and were hired during the period of the application of the Rooney Rule. And we've never reached that number of coaches since that time. So yes, is there a possibility? This is why there needs to be an organizational structure that oversees, as Diversity Lab oversees big law seeking Mansfield certification, oversees the collection of data, oversees the accountability, and calls for the sharing of that information.
Okay. I'm going to call on some raised hands, but also comment. ACR requires its chapters to appoint a diversity inclusion point person to the chapter board of directors. Are there any tips for the function of that role in the chapter organizations?
Well, I think one suggestion is always to be on the lookout. What are your conferences look like? What do your meetings look like? Who are your presenters? I'm not saying that it has to be a certain number, but have you thought about newer people, younger people, people from various different perspectives with regard to presentations and that sort of thing? So that's just one thing that a diversity coordinator could do.
Okay, Shakira, you have your hand raised. If you'll unmute yourself.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. This has been very compelling. I'm concerned about the question of equity and inclusion. Once you bring in diverse candidates, if you are truly seeking diversity, what you're actually doing is moving towards changing the quality of the culture, which is what I think the gentleman earlier who spoke was referencing. When you talk about bringing in corruption and so forth with technically diverse candidates, what you're referencing, I think, is that if you bring in these diverse candidates, then what are you going to do to actually include them in the organization? Because if they come in and they come in with their own perspective, it's very much going to change the quality of the corporate culture. And are people ready for that is the question. Do you think that organizations are ready to allow themselves to be impacted by new sources of excellence and professionalism?
Well, I think that is a question that I can only say some are and some obviously are not. But you are absolutely right that it's not enough to simply to bring in diverse people. The analogy I heard once was diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion means being asked to dance and to select the tunes to which you will be dancing from time to time. And the work the latter part of that work is just being done. That the degree of impact of a critical mass of diverse persons and on the culture is something that I think we ought to be concerned with, we ought to be looking at. A colleague of mine in Toronto has written a very interesting article, which will be coming out in the Cumberland Law Review, addressing this issue. I'm not at liberty to share that yet because it's not been published, but she addresses the issue of culture.
Giovanna. Unmute.
Hello,
There you
good
go.
morning. Thank you for the event. I have a question in regard to public organizations involved in dispute resolution, because I haven't seen many studies that consider like the role of court-based programs, and especially considering that usually in court-based ADR programs, the administration can choose the neutrals. Do you think that it would be also important to have a commitment of these organizations?
Yes, I think the commitment is important. I think that one of the challenges, having worked with some federal public agencies, is that there may be statutory barriers to the data collection. And that is something that we're working through with them, but making the commitment and working toward trying to find ways around some of those impediments, because the collection of data is an important part of what has to be done. Governmental entities have a bit more challenges with regard to that.
John Lamau.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for this wonderful program. I'm a mediator in the Hudson Valley in New York. I do a lot of community mediations, and I also do lemon law arbitrations. But my day job is working for a labor union, so I'm really interested in some of that discussion about the panel arbitrators for labor arbitrations, grievance arbitrations and so forth. The reason I bring it up is because, I spent, 30 years working for a union that was dominated by, telephone company, middle-aged white guys kind of stuff. And now the union I'm in is in New York City, which is white collar, predominantly women, people of color, public sector, health and hospitals. And then we have a whole bunch of people that work at different nonprofits. And I'm bargaining some of those contracts right now. And I'm considering, maybe we can get this 30% rule into those contracts as we go. Typically, nonprofits are really good because they have similar, principles as unions, but sometimes only until they're the employer and you're the union, then all of a sudden, it's a little different. But when it comes to this question of diversity on the panels, I guess what I want to know is, for the sake of diversity, yeah, I think lots of people would support it. And as one of the gentlemen said earlier, this is the sort of the trend nowadays anyway. But what about, what effect does it have on the quality of the decisions that come out of arbitrations? To have a more diverse panel and to have more people of color or other protected classes selected, how does that affect the decisions is my question.
Mm-hmm.
My assumption is that the persons who would come under the rubric diverse are as qualified as those who would not come under the rubric of diverse. And therefore, in terms of quality of analysis, quality of reasoning of the arbitration award, you will see no difference. What the difference that will be made, and you mentioned the constituency whom you represent, who are women, persons of color, would have a different experience, perhaps, that the process is being conducted by someone who understands better the shoes in which they have walked, and therefore the diversity is useful in that respect. But the question of whether the decisions would be better decisions in terms of the way in which they're reasoned, I'm assuming qualified people are being selected at all times.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
There are a couple of questions connected. One is how do you attract more diverse candidates to the field? And then tangentially, harking back to the Rooney Rule in football, Mary Austin speculates that diverse coaches tend to have shorter reigns, and they tend not to get rehired if they're fired, and they're usually fired fairly quickly. And she wonders if that isn't also true in our field. If you get selected as a diverse candidate, arbitrator or mediator, and you don't knock it out of the park, as it were, what are the chances of you ever getting selected again?
Well, I'm assuming that what the parties want is, let's talk about arbitration. They want someone who can run a hearing fairly and efficiently, and they want someone who can write an award that is reasoned and well thought through. Now, if we find that our field is not doing that, then we've got a altogether different problem. And that's one my proposal doesn't address, but it doesn't mean that it's not something that we should be concerned about. At this point, certainly people of color often feel that they have to, quote, hit it out of the park in order to continue to work, and that may or may not be the case. Again, we know the history of the things that have gone on in this country that bring about those feelings. And perhaps that's something that we need to continue to study, look more into, and figure out the reality.
You know, here's another interesting one from Cheryl Agris, who says, what happens when you do have a 30% diversity group within the larger group, but they're all of one, they're all women, or they're all African-American, Black, or they're all whatever. Does that have any impact that would change the selection?
I'm not quite understand the question.
Right. Well, let me read it literally. As to who would be included in the pool, have you envisioned that the pool would just have 30% diverse, in quotes, members? There is always the risk that the 30% could include, for example, all women, all persons of color, etc. Cheryl, you might want to unmute yourself.
Well, here's the way
I can. Yeah, I'll just clarify that with the 30% rule that you might in the pool, you could have like 30% diverse neutrals, but they might all be of one particular category. So I was just wondering if you had considered that, that pool could, in a particular case, could just be all women, or it could be all persons of color, or it could be all Asian Americans, or is that something you've considered? Is that an issue for you? Or I was just wondering your thoughts.
It's something to consider. At this point, we know that we have made more progress in terms of gender equity than we have racial and ethnic equity. With regard to LGBTQ, we don't know as much. Mm-hmm. So yes, those are issues. But right now, I think if you look at most rosters, there have been marked improvement in the number of women who are selected as arbitrators and mediators. Not as much progress as I pointed out in my presentation, looking at the demographics of the National Academy of Arbitrators, not as much progress with regard to race.
there's several comments that suggest that there's a lot of research that says that diverse groups make better decisions. And gender, wait a minute, whereas participation of women on corporate boards directly correlates to improved financial results. There are a couple of these that suggest that when you have a pool and the pool is diverse, the results are more effective. I think that's really what I'm reading here. Gender equity can, go ahead, sorry.
And I think that's right, and that's where we start.
So how do we communicate that? How do we?
And this is why I want us to have a national collaboration around this, because there are lots of issues that I'm not going to be able to answer in the 45 minutes that I have here today or in one article, nor do I. And I have been a mediator as well as an arbitrator for 35 plus years. And the one thing I have learned, I hope I've learned a couple of others, but the one thing I've learned is that whatever answer I come up with, it's not going to be nearly as good as the one that I come up with in collaboration with others. And if there's one thing I'd like to leave with this group today is we need this national collaboration about diversity in ADR. We need to come up with a mechanism for bringing it about. As Maria will remember, there was a presenter at Spider who used to talk about, we need to start perhaps cussing and fussing in order to get to that kind of structure and organization that really puts teeth into the commitment for diversity.
Okay, let's see. Gender equity can be deceiving. I believe that it is still important to stratify by ethnicity when considering gender. Comment. Are you there?
Yeah, was there a question?
No, do you have a comment?
Both have to be considered.
Yeah, right. If all the women are white, then what kind of progress have we made? Okay, we're running out of questions here. Are there any others? Richard Sussman, you're talking about the STOP program and also tapping the corporate culture. Could you unmute yourself and clarify?
Unmute.
Yeah, I know. Hi, Julie.
Hi.
Actually, I wasn't a participant in the STOP program. I've met a few graduates along the way as adults. I just think it is a one model that successfully engaged minority young people in rewarding experiences in dispute resolution. I don't think that the people from GNY who started it believe that the corporate culture would be interested in promoting such programs. I later became an ombudsman, and the IOA, International IAO, International Association of Ombudsmen, gets tons of corporate funding for internal dispute resolution programs within these corporations. And I think the interest of the private sector, whether they're motivated by social control aspirations, don't see the empowerment potential, is something that we've tended to overlook. I mean, I remember when we were celebrating the inclusion of ADR in a TV show. I think we have to be more assertive to the corporate community about funding programs that mainstream this ADR.
I think that's a good idea. I would agree.
Sephora has a question. Unmute yourself, Sephora.
I am not muted. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay. Hi. So I have a dilemma about diversity and inclusion. See if you can weigh in on it. So I helped in a large organization of 48,000 members start a peer mediation program. So we went out to the community of 48,000 people. We advertised that we're looking for mediators. We had applicants, and out of the applicants, we chose 20 mediators to start the program with. And I went ahead and trained all 20. 2 out of the 20 were of women of color. And then we went through the training, and it became obvious to me during the training, more than during the interview, that some people just are not going to make it. I know it. I've been in this business for over 30 years. But I felt the pressure that 2 women of color are not going to make it. And as hard as we tried, and I feel that there was some pressure to bring them in because they were the only 2 who applied anyway. So there was this pressure to bring in because we wanted to have a diverse group of mediators. So 2 years after trying and mentoring, and it's obvious to me that they don't qualify. There are some women, there are some mediators not of color that are also don't qualify. But I cannot get myself to say, okay, they just don't qualify because they're people of color now. And now I feel obligated to keep mentoring them because I'm worried that if we don't continue with them, that there's going to be a backlash, that there's going to be, we will be labeled as being racist. I mean, I really am internally struggling because I look at real qualifications, and 2 years into it, there are some things that just don't work. Anyway, if anybody, or if you can weigh in the operation for advertising it again and increasing our pool, how to go about it without falling in that trap.
Are we still on?
Yeah, we're on.
I don't have a magic wand.
Right.
And the RCI and any other diversity initiative is not intended to change the basis of qualifications. If you had 2 persons of color who are not qualified, you perhaps had also 2 persons who were white. You only chose 20 out of 48 or whatever the number was. And so there were lots of whites who weren't qualified as well. Good faith is what we're looking for. I think that's the only thing I can advise. But it's clearly not a question that if we include or are concerned with diversity, that we are then reducing quality and qualifications. That is not the objective.
Okay. I want.
Yes, there are absolutely people of no color that didn't qualify. My question is, how do I keep them, because I don't want the backlash? Because if I tell a couple of white people that they are not qualified, they're not qualified. But my fear is to say that two people of color don't qualify. I feel that I'm at risk.
Well, you'll probably have to face that risk, is the only thing I can tell you.
Got to bite the bullet. Beth Belay.
Good morning, everybody. I'm not sure that I'm camera ready. So please excuse my not turning on my camera. You know, a few weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago now, I met with a group that I'm preparing to coach around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Their group had a pretty significant and somewhat traumatic experience regarding trying to bring in somebody into their organization who's a person of color, and it failed spectacularly. And in that conversation, somebody asked me for my qualifications, and it's not the first time that they have done that. This issue is, and it's not the first time I've had that experience. You know, this issue is so deep that I'm going to take a bit of a risk here and call out Professor LaRue, actually, because I went to your website because I was thinking to myself, hey, maybe I should add arbitration to, you know, the list of services that I offer and, you know, what's available. And I looked under your training, and I noticed that when you were talking about the training that you have available, you spent a lot of time talking about why you're qualified to train people. I mean, that's how deep it is, that a person of your stature would have to make that a primary statement, you know, on your website, and it's all over the website. You know, what you've accomplished and the organizations you've led and are you know, are affiliated with, and I have to do the same thing. So I really want to speak to folks who are thinking about this qualifications issue and hope that they can turn their attention to the I'm sorry, this upsets me a lot. Turn their attention to the, and I've lost the word, the cultures, thank you, there it is. To turn their attention to addressing the cultures that are hostile to people of color. It's great to have mentorship, you know, it's great to provide resources to people of color and so forth. But in many ways, and you know, I've mentioned this to somebody else and they said to me that they didn't think that it was overstating it. It could be seen as an overstatement, but in many ways, it's like teaching women how not to get raped rather than addressing the issue of rape, right? So you're bringing people into hostile environments, expecting them to perform at the same level as everybody else, often bringing them in with massively high qualifications. I have a JD, but because of the circles that I work in, I'm actually very seriously considering getting a PhD. And a lot of the women, Black women in particular, women of color, but Black women in particular, who work in the same area that I do are getting PhDs for work that, you know, when we look at the people we're competing with, they don't have master's degrees a lot of the time. So I would really love for folks to start focusing more on the culture that produces the hostility and perhaps providing mentorship and resources for the folks who suffer from, you know, whatever it is that leads them to be skeptical or afraid of trusting people of color and their qualifications, you know, and their expertise. So yes, I mean, you know, I'm not going to turn down mentorship and so forth, but really, I think I've proven myself, and it would be great if we could, you know, pay as much attention, if not more attention, to the actual source of the problem.
I think your point is well stated. These are part of the, I think what you're stating is part of the what we need to be talking about much more carefully, much more extensively. And that's the only way we're going to be able to deal with some of these issues and find a way to address the cultural issues.
Alan Marks has his hand up.
The last speaker, I feel, addressed a lot of what I was trying to talk about. And that is, in a corrupt system, and we're talking about how far you pull back from the system and the transparency we're living in now with all of this, that do you want to eventually work from the inside and change what is corrupt? Can you actually work from the inside and change what is corrupt? Those to me are the bigger questions. Do you want to be a member of an organization that you don't want to be a member of the organization simply because you think you can make changes? I think it's all noble and I think it's all good, but we've seen in the 4 years of the Trump administration just how divided our country is in terms of equity and the idea of acknowledging the diversity in our country at all levels. Society has moved forward. Our culture has moved forward, but the laws and the institutions are desperately hanging on to what they have held on to. So I agree with everything that's being said, but I don't think it's implicit bias anymore. I think what we are facing is the bias that exists, and how do we make those kinds of changes through structures that are institutions? Can we actually, my question actually, I think, is, can we actually work in a corrupt system to change the corruption?
Well, I'm not certain that I would use the word corrupt as an explanation of what we're facing, but I do intend, during the few years that I have left in this profession, and I've been in it for over 38 years, to increase the speed, as I said at the beginning, of the bend of that slow arc of a moral universe toward justice. That's what I'm working for. I'm going to continue to work for that. I may be called overly optimistic in thinking that I can accomplish it, but I'll go to my grave with that optimism.
Shakira.
Yes, thank you so much. It is frustrating to me when we are attempting to address an issue, but we won't name the issue. We have been talking around the question of bias this morning. And in fact, the word bias hasn't even been used that frequently, when in fact that was the topic of this discussion. I'm working with an organization right now doing a DEI assessment, attempting to help them become a more equitable, inclusive, and diverse organization. And I am so happy that they are absolutely prepared to address racism, white supremacy, and white privilege head on, even while they won't say it, use those words explicitly in their mission statement because of where they're located and the power structures that they need to engage in. Internally, they use those words frequently and freely because they understand that that is what the challenge is. People, everyone in this country is impacted by internalized racism. And that is what we need to address. I don't know why we hesitate to use that language. We can't solve what we won't name.
Thank you. Someone has suggested that we just go to hand raising. And those of you who have comments to make, Dennis, you had your hand up. So unmute yourself, and anyone else who wants to say something, participate in this dialogue, raise your hands, okay?
And Julie, may I say something before the next speaker? I don't feel compelled to respond to every comment that is made.
Right.
If somebody wants to ask me specifically, that's fine, but I don't. It feels.
So to that end, maybe it might be more useful right now if you had a question to pose the question, because Homer won't be here forever. Okay. I just called on someone and now I've forgotten who. Where are you? There you are.
You called on me. Thank you for the opportunity. Professor LaRue, we are neighbors. I mediate through the multi-door program here in DC. Given your last comment, the 30% number seems to be a magical number. My experience has been that we don't go from 0 to 100 in a blink. And I'm curious if you want to follow Justice O'Connor's lead with the 2028 suggestion or projection, and speculate how long before you see that we reach that minimum goal that you've identified based on the statistics of a 30% threshold.
Well, I stopped making predictions when I predicted the outcome of a Supreme Court case before a professor of mine when I was in law school, and I was correct and he was wrong. And I figured I better hang this, having done that one well, I better hang that one up. So I couldn't tell you that. What I do know is that if we continue to simply talk about aspiration, we won't get there. That we need to put metrics, we need to set goals. And I'm not talking about quotas. I'm talking about goals in the way that the Mansfield Rule works, goals in the way that I'm suggesting the Ray Corollary would work. Perhaps a year from now, I'd be prepared to tell you it's a date, but no, I can't give you a prediction. I wish I could.
Harvey Newman, what is your question?
Hi. Yeah. Yeah, I'm in the middle of helping my wife right now, but it's not really a question. It's really something I'd like to share quickly. And that is, I just watched the three shows of the National Geographic, Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's based on Jared Diamond's book. And I think we have to educate people on this whole idea of European white supremacy and the fact that this man spent 30 years explaining how this came about. And it's a total accident of nature. It has nothing to do with race. We are one race. We are the human race. And when we start to educate people of that, we can stop this nonsense about wanting to change people's races, and other forms of diversity, culture, and all of that has to do with just guns, germs, and steel. Okay, so thank you. Have a wonderful day.
All right, we are running out of questions here. If there are no more, I want to personally thank Nikki for all of the links she's posted in the chat. You all, if anything was said that intrigued you, I think you'll find a reference in the chat. And Homer, thank you so much for working through our technical difficulties and giving us such a powerful presentation. Let's hope that Justice Day O'Connor, maybe we'll see that goal and maybe we'll all work toward it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for your time this morning and for the discussion.
And you will see in the chat, Homer, all kinds of accolades and applause and gratitude. So have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. And we will be posting this public chat and the video on the ACRGNY website very shortly. So thank you for everybody. And if you missed the beginning, you can catch up on it there. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Bye. And everyone who's registered will also